Have you ever read a terrible fight scene? Sometimes I don't care about the characters, so it feels meaningless. Some fight scenes go on and on and on, and the reader stops caring. And some fight scenes focus on every single detail and start to get monotonous. If your book needs a fight scene, that's wonderful. Keep watching, and I'll teach you the 8 tips on how to create a fantastic one. I'll start with the least important tips and then escalate up to the most important one. Number 8, create imbalances. Perfectly equal fights can be boring, but if you create asymmetries between your fighters, that makes the reader question who's gonna win. Take a look at this fight in Game of Thrones. Here we have the Mountain versus Martell, Prince of Dorne. One is very light, nimble, quick, while the other one is hefty, large, and powerful. You would think an asymmetry would make the reader think they know who's gonna win, but since underdog stories are so popular, they're gonna second guess that assumption. Here are some other asymmetries you can use. Expert versus newbie, young versus old, armed versus unarmed. You can even have a fight where it's 1 versus 100, like in the Kill Bill scene where she's fighting the Crazy 88s. Number 7, choose weapons. The first step in writing your fight scene is to choose original, unusual weapons. For instance, this is my Samoan war axe. I got it when I taught school in Samoa for a summer. It is heavy, and I could do some serious damage with it. A non-traditional weapon tells the reader volumes about the character. Just imagine the type of character who would wield this. Yes, a ton of fights involve characters with really natural weapons. Fists, knives, guns, but unusual weapons do make for more interesting fights. For instance, in Kill Bill, Gogo uses a very unusual weapon, a meteor hammer. Just by the weapon alone, we know she must be highly trained, that it does not look easy to master, and that she's very unpredictable. But to write effectively about this weapon, or really any weapon, you have to make sure you understand the weapon. A bad fight scene is where the author doesn't really understand the history, the style, and the moves of a particular weapon. It is also a good idea to use improvised weapons. In The Bourne Identity, Matt Damon finds a pin on a desk and stabs his opponent with it. The reader's gonna see the resourcefulness of your character when your character uses whatever is nearby to attack their opponent. Or in the Mission Impossible bathroom fight, we see a guy rip a pipe out from a sink and use it as a weapon. But remember this, you don't only have to use a single weapon. Look at how often they switch weapons in this iconic fight scene in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. They start with swords and machetes, move to a spear, shift to a hooked sword, there's some throwing stars in there, they even get to a brass club. In that fight, changing weapons makes the fight seem like it's escalating and progressing. Number 6, shift momentum. Fights are about momentum. You should always have one character be winning and then shift and change the advantage. Just watch any of the Rocky movies and you can see this shift a half dozen times. Rocky's losing, momentum change. Oh, Rocky's winning. It's best if you show that momentum shift through something the character actually does. In Princess Bride, the momentum shifts because one fighter switches from their left hand to their right hand.
I am not left-handed.
And then the momentum shifts back when the other fighter reveals they are actually right-handed.
I'm not left-handed either.
Here is a good rule of thumb. After every paragraph of your fight scene, the reader should be able to tell who is winning. And then in the next paragraph, shift the momentum to the other character. Momentum shifts keep the reader wondering, who's gonna win? They don't know, but they're gonna keep reading to find out. Number 5, progress the plot. Have you ever seen fake fights in a movie or read them in a book? These are fights that seem inserted just to get some action. They don't have a purpose. They're usually based on misunderstanding, and once that misunderstanding is cleared up, they're immediately friends. Fights must impact your plot. If your character loses, X should happen. If your character wins, Y should happen. And part of plotting is understanding what your character wants from this fight. They don't just want to win, maybe they want to humiliate their opponent. They don't just want to win, they want to protect their daughter. They don't just want to win, they want to earn respect from their peers. And ask yourself, if this fight was taken out from my story, would my story still make sense? If your answer is yes, then just delete that fight. Here's an example of an essential fight. At the end of the first Matrix movie, we see Keanu Reeves playing Neo fight the agents with one hand behind his back. This is a huge plot-moving fight. Neo is now better than the machines. If we didn't have this fight, the movie literally wouldn't feel complete. Number 4, escalate wounds. A really bad way to have a fight scene and have characters, duke it out and then one wins. It's a much better idea to show little small injuries leading to greater and greater injuries until someone wins. Show one character getting nicked, and then another character getting nicked, then a much more serious injury, and then a debilitating injury. Just remember, wounds aren't only physical. Wounds also include someone who is temporarily blinded, for instance by sand, something like dizziness or exhaustion. In the second John Wick, there's an absolutely fantastic fight scene where John Wick gets beat up in a lot of different ways before the end of the fight. It starts with him getting hit by a car, then he's thrown down a long flight of stairs, he's stabbed in the chest, he's strangled, and he's thrown through glass. Number 3, adds strategies and mistakes. If we have a sense of how your fighter approaches the fight and then how they change their strategy as the fight progresses, that's fantastic. It makes the reader feel like the fight's progressing, and we also get to see the psychology of your character. In the Jack Reacher books, he talks about his strategy of a cigarette punch. It's basically a trick. You offer a cigarette to the guy you're fighting, he opens his mouth just enough to put it in, and right at that moment, he gives him an uppercut, breaks his jaw, fight over. It's important to note that the explanation of this happens inside a fight in the book. He's describing a strategy of how he's trying to knock out this other guy. And in The Princess Bride, we get to hear the actual names of sword fighting strategies. Bonetti's defense.
You're using Bonetti's defense against me, huh? I thought it fitting considering the rocky terrain.
Capoferra.
Naturally. You must expect me to attack with Capoferra.
Thibault.
Naturally. But I find that Tybalt cancels out Capoferra. Don't you?
And Agrippa.
Unless the enemy has a study, he's Agrippa. Which I have.
A scene like this does three things. One, it shows both men are expert swordsmen. Two, it shows the author knows the intricacies of sword fighting. Three, it makes the fight scene much more complex. Number two, the second most important thing to write a good fight scene is to study written fight scenes. I know you've probably watched thousands of fight scenes on the screen, but how many have you read in books? What works on the screen doesn't often work on the page. Let's look at the knife fight in Dune, which I think is one of the absolute best fight scenes ever written in a book. I'm going to break it down into 8 things we can learn from this fight scene. 1. Paul Atreides remembers the words of his mentor throughout. Idaho had warned him time and again, when in doubt of your service, bare feet are best. The words of his mentor create this ongoing motif that ties the whole fight together. 2. We get access to his thoughts during the fight. I'm afraid, Paul told himself. Fear is the mind killer. 3. There's an early wound. Blood dripped from the injury for a moment, stopped. Paul wins an early victory by drawing first blood, and the momentum shifts to him. 4. There's not a ton of action. The fight is 5 pages long in Dune, but if you add up the actual parts that describe character movements, it's less than half a page. That means the fight is mostly about strategies, thoughts, dialogue, and what the spectators are thinking. 5. Jameis commits a mistake. He feels trapped, he feels too aggressive, and so he attacks, and that allows Paul to get the upper hand. 6. There is a trick and surprise at the ending. Jameis leaped high, feinting and striking down with his right hand, but the hand was empty. The crysknife had been shifted to his left hand. In the end, Paul wins, but I love how Paul's mother responds. Point 7, she has a counterintuitive response. Instead of congratulating her son when he wins, she says in this voice of scorn, "Well now, how does it feel to be a killer?" Jeez, Mom, thanks a lot. But she does this because she doesn't want him to be prideful and start to get hungry to kill other people. It's actually great psychological manipulation. 8. This fight affects the plot. This fight is how Paul Atreides wins the respect of all the Fremen. This is also how Paul wins an original name, Muad'Dib, which means like a little jumping mouse. Without this fight, the Fremen never would have accepted him. If you want to read the extended text of that fight and 11 others, just Google 11 fight scenes on BookFox. And lastly, here is the #1 rule when writing a fight scene. This is the biggest mistake when writing a fight scene. As an editor, I've seen this mistake so often. Beginning writers tend to write non-stop action. My writing teacher Janet Fitch used to call this type of writing Frankenstein writing, meaning it's just movement after movement, like Frankenstein lumbering on words. Purely physical writing ends up getting boring. So what do you layer in around the actual fight? Good question. Here are 3 ideas. 1, add the thoughts of characters. Just like in that Dune fight scene, we should be hearing what they're thinking. 2, pause and add dialogue between characters. Now, I'm not saying to write a whole paragraph of dialogue. That would be boring. But to have a single short line, a little snippet, a little argument, a little insult, that works very well. 3, describe the spectators, describe the environment. In a movie, this all takes place in the background, but in a book, you have to do the work of describing the physical environment. When authors write non-stop action in a novel, it means they're trying to replicate the experience of a movie, but books aren't movies. To learn more about how to write for books rather than writing for the screen, check out my video, Don't Let Movies Sabotage Your Writing. I hope that gives you some better ideas for what to do for fight scenes, and please subscribe.